So I'm just going to dig down a little bit into some of the collections we have here at the museum that connect to protest. It's going to be very rapid. Holdings on rural protest have been acquired through many different routes, but rarely through dedicated work here at the museum. Protest has, I think, probably never been the sole focus of active collecting, one possible exception being a very minor piece of Black Lives Matter focused work. I think this better Black Lives Matter work happened at other rural museums. There was an amazing display at St. Fagans that I saw, and I seem to remember colleagues in the network talking about projects that they had running in relation to that. So hopefully some of that might come up later. But broadly speaking, I think routes to acquisition of rural protest material here have largely been by accident rather than by design. They've come in through these various different routes, and I've listed those 1 to 8 down the left-hand side. I'll come back to those, so we won't focus in on those right now. I want to raise a few issues in relation to rural protest. The first is this, that we're talking about rural protest, but often rural protests are things that take place in urban contexts. So on the left, you can see an anti-factory farming protest in London in the early 1980s from the Farmers Weekly collection. Or they're really rooted in very hyper-local issues and campaigns. So the anti-road protests at the Newbury bypass in 1996, shown in the center there. Sometimes they're big campaigns and issues and protest movements that are not necessarily specifically about rural life, but happen to take place also in rural spaces. So again, Black Lives Matter in the Sticks, up at the top right in 2020 is a good example of that. And then sometimes it's about rural people coming into urban centres to kick up a fuss. And there's a really nice example of some land workers there campaigning in London in the 1990s. Sometimes there are issues about where these collections are held because they're not necessarily predominantly rural in terms of the issues that they're arguing about, or they're not necessarily held in coherent collections, because protest and campaign organizations can often be quite distributed. We end up with stuff in slightly weird places. These are some really nice institutional examples from the University of Reading, but surprisingly not from the collections of the Museum of English Rural Life, despite being protest posters designed for the National Union of Agricultural Workers. They're actually in the collections held in our typography department and shared courtesy of my colleague there, Emma Minns. So thank you to Emma for sharing these. But amazing resources, not where you would expect to find them. And I think that's quite common with this kind of material. And hopefully Katrina will give us a sense of digging out these kind of materials across different kind of archives and collections. We have to think about conflicts and ideology here as well. And rural issues, as we know, can be very polarizing. We only need look to contemporary issues around renewables or the future of landscape decision-making to know how polarizing they can be. This is one good example in that held in our collections, we have amazing stuff that speaks to vegetarian society protests in London in the 1980s. So things that are pushing back against farmers, but also protests on the flip side of that in terms of beef on the bone and arguing for greater freedoms for farmers and butchers in the 1990s, really contrasting questions and conflicts and ideology going on there. So something to bear in mind. There are some questions of legality and ethics around some of this, and I think this might come through a little bit, hopefully, in the way that Tom talks about these issues and challenges. I was challenged during a workshop here at the Museum of English Rural Life by one of the co-founders of Right to Roam, Nick Hayes, when I questioned whether or not I felt comfortable in attending this event that they held, a mass trespass on the grounds of Englefield Estate. At that point, well, it is in the hands of Richard Benyon, who was at that point a Conservative minister, a DEFRA minister. And they were campaigning, obviously, about rights of access to private land. The Benyon family have been significant contributors to and supporters of the University of Reading. So I just expressed a certain degree of discomfort and the question of whether or not institutionally I could attend these events. But there are other challenges as well in relation to this, in that mass trespass is, of course, a civil offence. It's not a criminal offence, but it's a civil offence. And therefore, the degree to which, under the auspices of the Museum of English Rural Life, I could actively participate in these in a participant observation fashion, it's a challenge and a question for us. I'm just going to rattle through those ways in which materials have entered the collection very quickly. Organizational archives, often campaign lobby activist organizations, often contain material related to protest. A couple of nice examples from the Open Spaces Society archives on the left there. Katrina, rather neatly, was Open Spaces Society research fellow here at the museum, so she can shed a bit more light on those. And on the right, we have a union banner connected to one of the agricultural labor unions. These materials have come into the collections because of wider archival holdings. Associated artifacts often creep in parallel to archival content connected to organizations. So they're a really key component of how these collections find homes in archives and museums. Journalism is a pretty critical one. We obviously have a whole load of published material in the library holdings of the museum. So at the bottom right, we've got an issue of Farmers Weekly with a Back British Farming protest poster from November 2024. So those of you who saw footage or coverage of those protests might recognize that sign, because quite a few people printed it out or had the printed version from the magazine. We have copies of that in the Merrill Library, that issue, and probably many other issues that pay reference to protest. But we also hold incredible protest materials in the press archive holdings that we have, in particular the Farmers Weekly and Farmer and Stock Breeder photographic archives, but also other related commercial photographers, like the Peter Adams example in the center. The one on the left, they're processing with a bunch of effigies and placards, and they're heading to a bonfire to burn them, which is just magnificent. In the library, we also have quite good examples of retrospective narratives about particular protest moments. On the left is the book written by Jim Hindle, who was one of the protesters on the aforementioned Newbury bypass protests, anti-road protests of the mid-1990s. And I'll come back to Jim Hindle shortly, but he lived up Middle Oak, which is pictured on the cover of his book for quite some period of time as part of those protests. In the center is a book by a memoir written by the emerging and really interesting nature writer Nicola Chester, in which she also pays reference to those anti-road protests. She was present at them as well, so a different perspective. And she also references the Greenham Women's Peace Camp protests as well. So looking through these kind of countryside narratives, these memoirs, for examples of protest is a really critical route into them. And on the right, we have a book, a relatively recent publication called Wild Service, co-edited by two of the founder members of the Right to Roam campaign. And in it, it contains reflections and narratives by a number of allied individuals who are connected either very directly or tangentially to that right to roam work and activism. So all of these kind of narratives are really interesting to give wider context, both contemporary and historical. Historical accounts are pretty critical too, and I'll leave it to Katrina to give us a far better sense of these kinds of perspectives. But just a couple of examples. On the left, Carl Griffin's work on the swing riots. In the center is a book that contains a really interesting piece on farm protest and countryside alliance protests of the turn of the century from the late 1990s, early 2000s by the late Alan Howkins. It's really worth checking out if you're interested in those period of protests. He sets it in that longer historical context of protest around farm issues as well. And on the right, again, another plug for Katrina's amazing book, which is out and buyable now. Retrospective collecting is a really critical component to trying to fill the gaps. But as I alluded to in the marketing information for this session, because these collections are so slippery, they're very ephemeral. If you're thinking about protest placards or the materials that people buy to attend protest, whether it might be stickers or T-shirts or those kinds of things, they often don't last particularly well. I've tried over the years since I arrived at the Merrill, so 2009, I've been trying on and off to reach out to farming community members to see whether anything survives from the countryside marches of that late 1990s, early 2000s period. Partly because I have a cousin, my father's cousin, attended one of those marches in Edinburgh, drove a tractor through Princes Street with his dog on it and delayed lots of traffic. So I have a kind of personal connection to some of that. And it's really interesting to know that That material, by and large, is hard to find. I think there must have been thousands and thousands of placards. I think 250,000 people turned up at one of those protests, supposedly. So there must be thousands and thousands of placards kicking around in farm sheds. Some of it must survive, but whether it survives in a good enough condition, I don't know. At the top left, these are all artifacts and pieces that were acquired through collecting 20th century rural cultures project, so Heritage Lottery funded retrospective collecting project. And they're examples of things connected to protest. But at the top left, we have that's a car sticker. It's actually a slight trick because it's been photographed in a way that makes the sticker visible. It was never used, which is why it survived. If it had been stuck to the car, it wouldn't survive. Bottom left, we've got a piece of Jim Hindle's clothing, which he wore up Middle Oak, and we have that on display in the museum. In the center at the bottom is a cartoon by Simon Thorpe, I think his name is, the artist who did the Farmer Palmer cartoons for Biz, lampooning that same period of farm protest. And we also have a mug that pays reference to similar Farmer Palmer issues and sort of takes on that period. And on the right, a fairly rare survival in terms of a poster promoting the work of the Women's Peace Camp at Greenham Common, which again, you know, could quite easily have never survived because there would have been a fairly limited print run. Rapid response collecting, I think, is part of the answer to this. But of course, we're judging the historical record and deciding what's important as it's emerging, rather than waiting for history to take place and for certain ephemeral things to dissipate and other more tangible things to survive. But I think we live in a much more throwaway culture now, so it's important for us to consider these things. On the right, from the November 2024 protests, I reached out immediately on social media, knowing that I wouldn't be able to get to any of those farm protests because I was already booked up in meetings and things. I reached out to Helen Rebanks, the farmer and writer from Cumbria, and she and her husband, James Rebanks, another rural writer, were planning on going. I could see that they were posting photos on social media of this amazing placard that she had made for them to attend with. And luckily it survived the trip down. They snapped off the handle on the train on the way home, but they kept it for me, and I was able to pop past on the M6 and just off the M6 and pick it up from them. Top left, some of you may remember Felicity McWilliams, who worked here at the Museum of English Rural Life for a time. She's now working in church heritage, not rural heritage, but she still bears us in mind. She happened to be in London on the day of the November 2024 protests and took a whole series of photographs for us. So thank you to Felicity for that. I also had some family members who were there as well, and they took some photos, but Felicity's were better. So I think they might make their way into the archives here at the museum. Creative practice is a way to, in some ways, embed some of the campaigns and work of activists in the work of museums. And we have to think carefully about how we do that. But at the top left is an example of an art project that some of you may have heard me talking about before. This ran during the COVID closure period and sort of reopened when we reopened to the public, an intervention around our galleries by 6 different artists, one of whom was an Australian artist called Sam Wallman. And he produced an amazing protest banner about the Commons that had never really been used in context of protest, but nevertheless contained sort of protest sentiments. And we've now acquired that into the collections. At the top right is a model of a threshing machine dating to, I think, the 1840s, not the 1830s, but nevertheless is a good touchstone object for thinking about the kinds of machines that were smashed during the swing riots. And as such, it's been subject to creative responses in terms of both poems and a song written by one of our volunteers at the museum. And at the bottom, I'll be borrowing this next year for a display, but this is the washing line of history from the most extraordinary performance piece, 3 Acres and a Cow, which tells a history of protest and performance around land and land rights in England over a very long period, as you can see from the washing line. So I'll have a version of this washing line of history, which is constantly being added to and evolving as the performance runs on. It's been running for over a decade now. I think a critical thing that we need to consider, and I think we should consider this across the network rather than just individual institutions like the Merrill considering it, is that wider process of community engagement and how that might lead to future archival holdings being more robust around protest and protest materials. We have to consider this in light of the digital turn and the degree to which institutions aren't necessarily able to archive and retain tangible examples of their work or tangible examples of the planning of their work. So if we think about institutional minutes and the ephemeral nature of those in archival contexts nowadays, you've got to sort of broaden that out and think how we might have the vestiges of these kind of moments of protest that are also quite ephemeral. On the left-hand side, we've got 3 examples of things connected to the Dartmoor Rising campaigns, one of which is far too large to bring into the collections formally and permanently. It's a costume of old Crockern, which was a sort of folk spirit of Dartmoor, animated through the work of a group called the Lost Giants, and used in performative mass trespasses as part of those campaigns about wild camping and restrictions to wild camping on Dartmoor. I'm pleased to say Old Crockern is hopefully coming to the Merrill to appear in the displays next year, but only on a loan basis. I think Maddie and others might be worried if we were trying to acquire Lost Giant folklore costumes writ large. I was also offered today by Rewild Our Ghost Woods, which is a subset of Wildcard, a nature campaign. I was offered the chance to acquire a lemon slug that is 10 foot high, a costume again made by the Lost Giants. I politely declined that for now, but I am very excited about the possibility of potentially displaying it at some point. At the bottom left, one of those signs, and possibly both of them, are potentially going to make their way into our collections at some point, but they're currently in the Southwest, and I haven't been able to get hold of them yet, and didn't want them just to be posted. And in the center is an image from Guy Shrubsole, the land rights campaigner's social media feed, which I responded to ask whether the map that he's holding is available to purchase. And it turned out it was a sort of one-off print. So I actually contacted Materiality, who he'd worked with, and had a copy of it printed for the collection. So we do have at least an image of Old Crockern, albeit in black and white, and the cover of a map in the collections. On the right, the Rewild Our Ghost Woods campaign banner there is coming as part of a display that we're hosting next year. Maybe the lemon slug too, but we'll see. And just finishing off with this plaster cast at the hands of Joseph Arch, the one-time president of the National Agricultural Labourers Union. These are on display in the museum, so just a little nod to the fact that this stuff does make its way through into display in various different forms and guises. And displaying protest comes with its own challenges, particularly around those more contentious and contemporary protests. I'm going to bung a few links in the chat, but I'm going to finish sharing and hand over to Katrina now, I think. So I'll bung those links in the chat while you get set up, Katrina. If anyone has questions, I think we'll come to those at the end. But please do bung questions in there if you've got any.
Right. Shall I start?
Yeah, over to
Thanks,
you, Katrina.
Ollie. Great. So I'm just going to again do a whistle-stop tour through some of the types of sources that I've used as a historian studying rural protest, and it touches on many of the things that Ollie has already picked up on. So apologies if there's a bit of repetition here. But first of all, one of the questions that Ollie posed actually, and something that really exercises historians, is around the difference between rural and urban protests. Is there something distinctly rural about protest? Are we talking about protests that are done by residents of rural areas? What do we class as rural? Or are we talking about protests that happen in rural areas but could be done by people coming in from more urban areas? So it's a permeable divide between the two. But one of the big influences that have shaped a lot of historians of rural protest initially was the work on Captain Swing by Eric Hobsbawm and George Roudet in the 1960s, the kind of best-selling book on Captain Swing. But relatively more recently, from the 1990s, work by James C. Scott, who was a sociologist, anthropologist, quite controversial figure in his biography, but his influence around thinking about weapons of the weak, that actually rural people don't leave enough sources. They quite often are in oral cultures that don't leave much in terms of paper sources, written sources. And also we've got to look at protests between the lines. So they don't necessarily have protests that are collective, that are open. Quite a lot of rural protest is around what Scott called deferential bitterness. So a rural worker not doffing his cap to his landlord or his employer. And I think there are particularly rural types of protest. We tend to see protest as much more individualistic, can be done by much smaller groups of people, quite often at night, in disguise. Arson is often a key feature in the 19th century and into the 20th century that we see in rural areas, and also threatening landowners, threatening individuals. So one of our key sources for the swing rights are swing letters, which are signed by the anonymous leader, Captain Swing. And the swing letter that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen was sent to me actually in an email by the archivist at Dunedin in New Zealand, who had received a collection from an emigrant who'd come over in the 1840s, I think, and this was in their bundle and they didn't know quite what to make of it. So again, what Ollie said about finding protest sources in unusual or unexpected types of archives, this was a letter that had been brought over by a migrant from Yorkshire. And so actually you have to piece together people's life histories quite often to find, they've migrated to Australia or America and they have taken pieces of this protest history with them. So Captain Swing is seen as kind of the kind of typical type of rural protest in the 19th century. What do we do with when we've got very little evidence? Quite a lot of my work focuses on mapping protest, using reports in the newspapers, using reports in local authority papers, magistrates' correspondence, government correspondence, and mapping sites of protest often tells us something about patterns of movement, whether groups are moving from one place to another to incite action in other areas, trying to inspire action in other areas. So again, this is a map of swing in East Yorkshire, trying to map it. Are there patterns of arson? Are there patterns of other types of action? And again, you're looking at these through secondary sources almost, in terms of it's the authorities trying to clamp down on activity. So it depends on who gets caught. And as I said, rural protesters much harder to pin down because they're often anonymous. They're often doing things individually at night in disguise. So we're clutching at straws quite often and inferring in patterns from much less evidence than we have for collective urban protests that is much more organised, much more public. Marginal communities, again, we associate with rural protest. Ollie mentioned the Open Spaces Society image collection, which I've used extensively. And although most of that collection is all not of people, there are some slides which have images of different types of groups that may protest in different ways. So again, not always collectively, but often cumulatively are unheard voices of marginalised communities. So there's quite a few examples of Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities in the archives who collectively resist their eviction off commons as they become enclosed or urbanised. They're not protesting per se in these particular images, but cumulatively you can see patterns of resistance or at least dissent in the images. And again, Ollie's mentioned organised protest. I've used examples of the mass trespass. Less well known than the Kinder Scout is the Sunnyside mass trespass, which happens in Bradford in the West Riding. The Open Spaces Society have lantern slides of that. And again, triangulating that with newspaper reports, magistrates' correspondence about that. And then there's organised groups like the CPRE, who organise campaigns to save particular commons or save particular open spaces for preservation. But again, most often you find that material items, non-textual items have to be preserved from the people who were involved in them. So when you move into the 20th century, we are trying to preserve things that aren't necessarily within an organised group's collection. So earlier on in this year, I was part of a residency held at Greenham Common at an art space, the 101 Arts Residency, and they invited some ex-Greenham women to come and show their existing collections that they still hold at home. So this one was showing two Greenham women who'd got blankets that one of them had embroidered while they were in prison after they'd been arrested at Greenham Common. And so many of the items that we have, still in private collections, still rely on people trying to find participants in protests, capture their oral history stories, and photograph their material items that perhaps aren't kept in museum standard conditions, but really important for them personally as part of their personal histories. And then finally, ephemera, rural protests, both within rural societies, but also the urban groups that come into rural environments, particularly in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s as part of environmental movements, anti-roads movements, hunt-saboteur movements, tend to produce quite a lot of ephemera. And again, it depends on individual collectors in those movements, donating them to Merle or other places, or digitising them. And there is quite a lot of material digitised by Mayday Rooms, 58A Collective, various other collectives who've put them on archive.org, which again is quite a fragile, precarious way of disseminating these, but I've been able to use those, particularly accessible when you can't go to these places in person. So I've used these sorts of published material, fanzines, zines, leaflets that are again by the volunteer kindness of their own community archivists have put those up online to tell those stories. But again, a lot of those are fragmentary and not always available. So it's much more of a patchwork effort being a historian of those types of more ephemeral rural protests than your standard urban organised protests. But that makes it an exciting challenge, and often you come up with much more interesting archival material than you might do with traditional protest movements. So I'll leave it there.